Well, hello, and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. He normally talks to us about German politics, but he's here instead to talk about his homeland, Ireland, and its relationship with the Catholic Church. Indeed, Derek Scally has written a whole book on the subject. It's called The Best Catholics in the World. And hello and welcome, Derek.
Good evening, Liz. Hello, everybody.
Great to have you here. From the outset, this seems like a fairly straightforward book. The dwindling power of the church in Ireland is undeniable. Sex scandals and an increasingly secular identity have caused many to question the religion's influence in Ireland. But this book goes a lot further than that, arguing, I think, that there's a collective responsibility here that many Irish or the Irish people are reluctant to address. The parallel here is, of course, Germany, where Derek is based, and its willingness to deal with the past. But first of all, Derek, just give us a flavour. I mean, you actually, Berlin's really now your home, and you've been there for almost 2 decades now. So sort of going to Ireland is almost like another country for you, isn't it?
It is. It's a country that's disappeared really before my eyes. I mean, Germany has transformed in the last 20 years, just like lots of countries touched by the Cold War. But when I go back to Dublin, I see a country also transformed. There wasn't a Berlin Wall that fell. What fell was the Catholic Church. And that has released all sorts of energies in all sorts of directions. I go around Dublin now and I don't recognize the country. It's rather multicultural. Sundays is a normal shopping day. And all of the old certainties, are gone. I was born in 1977, so I joke I had the last of the Catholic childhoods. And I never could have imagined as a child or even as a teenager that it would all just be washed away or it would all just collapse so quickly. I think it was a bit like some sort of a Catholic Potemkin village. It all looked very nice, but a big wind came, and the wind was modernity and secularism, but also sex scandals. And the whole thing has just collapsed. And now we're kind of people in Ireland are standing around trying to ignore everything that's collapsed and say, oh, well, I'd like another latte or some sourdough bread. Yeah. And I'm just saying, hang on, something just happened here. Can we talk about what just happened? But like a lot of countries have been through traumatic experience, the first instinct is let's move on. And as a typical bad immigrant, I said to myself, no, something's not right here. And I had this niggle about Ireland, and I first thought it's just the usual immigrants niggle. Everyone who leaves a country, they always have a bone to pick with the country oftentimes. And then I realized, no, it's something deeper. I said there's a huge silence. And throughout this process, I realized silence can be quite loud. And there's a huge silence in Ireland towards our collective responsibility as a society for what just happened. Because what just happened in Ireland is staggering.
You refer to the German phrase, and I'm going to get this completely wrong. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Say it properly. So I've ballsed it up.
Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Mark Twain he wrote a wonderful book about the German language. He said German words are sometimes so long they have their own perspective. So yes, Vergangenheitsbewältigung is the word.
And that means what? And I think why it's useful is sort of in contrast to the sort of, I'm just trying to get you to sort of describe some of the sort of casual attitudes that you come across in the book. I mean, the reflections upon the church and recent history and how those two things jar.
Yes, well, Vergangenheitsbewältigung is a process that came about in Germany by accident, by design, by hit, by miss. And it's what we could have considered Germany's superpower now. Unlike a lot of other countries, Germany decided at some point, I would say it was actually a few decades after the Second World War, to realize that you cannot just talk about the Nazis. You have to talk about the society in which this all was possible, the crimes of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And this process came about really only in the late 60s. And it basically involved the entire society realizing without all of us, this couldn't happen. And nobody today is being told you must forever atone for the sins of your parents, your grandparents. All they say is today is you, as a German, there is a moral responsibility to understand circumstances that could make that possible. Yeah. So it's part of the terms and conditions of being German. And this was a great help for them when the Berlin Wall fell, very different circumstances, the collapse of communism, the communist German state. But they had these tools and institutions and a framework for looking at their past as a collective, not just a sort of a people up there and people down there and us and them. They had this notion of history is made by all of us. Some people have more power, some people have less power, some people have influence, money, a means of changing history. Other people go along with history, but even going along with history, you as a small person change the history of your country.
So what I want to do is jump back and forth within the book a bit, if we can. And I think one of the questions you ask, which is really important, what I want to come on to, which is, what is the Catholic Church in Ireland? How does it come about? And one of your arguments is, well, let's start there, is that it's you thought of it as just being the Catholic Church, but you realized it was actually the Irish Church as much as Germany has its own version of the Catholic Church.
Yes, moving to Germany, I the first time I went to a Catholic Mass in Germany, I was convinced I'd gone into a Protestant service because it was so Protestant. It was like there was mass books and numbers up on a board and lots of singing. I was convinced I'd gone to a Protestant church, and then I realized, no, Catholicism in Germany is quite influenced by Luther and Protestantism. And over the years, I realized that Irish Catholicism, while it's technically Roman Catholicism, it is Irish. It is as much Irish as Catholic. And once you realize that, I realized the first assumption, the flawed assumption that many Irish people make. We've had Catholicism since the late 5th century with St. Patrick, of St. Patrick's Day fame. And many people think, oh, we've had this continuous Catholicism since then, therefore we are effectively the origin of the species. And Catholicism has not really existed continuously in many other countries in the world the way it has in Ireland. But then I realized it was actually a product of the 19th century and traumas of the 19th century, famine, occupation, and the Catholic Church sort of reformulated itself in the 19th century to meet certain emotional needs and economic needs of a country living under British rule that had just lost 1 million of its population to hunger and 1 million to emigration. And this Catholic Church offered salvation. It offered sort of a comfort in an era before.
Let's come back to that in a second, because there's a particular chap, there's a reforming character in the Irish Church in the 19th century. He makes key changes. So let's come back to that in just a second. But I want to talk, you met with Paddy Doyle, the author, and he produced The God Squad. It was 1987 he came out, 1988, around that time?
88.
88, yeah. And the reactions to his book are very informative. So just talk a bit about that and how that reflects Irish reactions to the church typically.
Well, most people will be familiar with the Irish Catholic Church these days only through abuse headlines. I mean, long even before the US or Australia, we're having stories of clerical sexual abuse that started in Ireland in the mainstream way in the late 90s. But actually a decade before that, we had this book you referred to, The God Squad, and it was referring to a child whose parents died when he was young. His mother died young, his father hanged himself. He was then committed by a court, found guilty of being an orphan and committed to a religious institution.
This is Paddy Doyle's own life.
Yes, and he wrote a book about his experiences of being basically abused, having illness, not being diagnosed in time, experiments, sexual abuse, physical abuse. And he wrote a book about a boy called Paddy himself. And he said, look, I'm telling this story now, not because I think I can change it or you could change it for me, and I don't want your sympathy. Have we really banished this brutality? And Irish Catholicism had a vicious, brutal side to it. Have we banished this from our society, or is it still lingering there? And in the late 90s or the late 80s, Irish people did not want to know. People did not want to know what they knew was going on. And not that everybody knew what was going on. The children were being locked up, children were being abused, women were being locked up without trial and being abused. We just felt I think there's a tremendous sadness now looking back that many people knew, enough people knew for this to happen, but many people felt powerless to do anything about it. And I think what my book is trying to do is approach these people in a compassionate way and say, what did you know? What did you see? What was your Catholic Ireland like? And using some of the German tools to try and maybe interrogate your own personal path rather than
I want to sort of delay that insight for just a second and get there in a moment, because I think it's very important. But there were sort of broadly two reactions to Paddy Doyle's book, which one were those damn nuns, how the hell could they do this to you? And then, for example, in his hometown, Wexford, ostracism of him, how the hell could you do this to Ireland, kind of thing. So
well, it shows how closely Catholicism and Irish national identity were fused. So you actually couldn't, what you see in Poland today, it was impossible to attack the Catholic Church because it was the ultimate expression of Irishness. Attack one, you're attacking the other, and you would have Ireland Inc. would come back at you from all sides.
Yeah. And the point about it today is that with the sex scandals, Ireland does feel as though it's moved on and it's separated itself from its deeply Catholic identity. But this is what you're exploring. So things have moved on significantly since Paddy Doyle.
Yes, but I'm arguing in the book that we may have moved on, but we haven't explained why that was possible, and we haven't actually interrogated any of the dynamics that made.
So
that
let's
possible.
go back. Let's go back to the mid-19th century. What happened with the Catholic Church in Ireland at that time? At the same time as you've got this big push away, Britain is the dominant power. Protestant. There's the Anglo-Irish dominating the Catholic Irish, and there's essentially repression going on. How does the Catholic Church fit into that?
The Catholic Church in Ireland always responded by adapting. When we had St. Patrick, we had decades, centuries of British oppression and occupation, and the Catholic Church survived, sometimes well, sometimes less well, by adapting, by going along with the system, by acting as, in many cases, a system of support to the British rule in Ireland. But this was really starting to crumble by the mid-19th century, and we had this huge potato famine, which some of your viewers may be familiar with. So once that had happened, and we had this sort of removed any last vestiges of moral authority of British rule in Ireland, that people were being allowed to starve even though food was available. So the Catholic Church provided a place for people to go, a place for people to understand that something bigger was happening, that maybe all this death and destruction was not in vain. And they basically reformulated the Catholic message, which is, of course, a salvation message, and that suffering somehow has a meaning. And for people who couldn't go to a therapist, having a priest telling you that there is a meaning to this meaninglessness, apparent meaninglessness, was hugely helpful. But they offered order. They came in and they created hospitals and schools, and they gave people hope. They gave people pride. And they gave people a sense of ownership of their country, because this had been taken from them by the British. And the Catholic Church provided an ersatz home. It was a spiritual home in the islands that existed, but while the island wasn't under their control, the Catholic Church provided them with a home. And they provided order, but they demanded control. And as soon as the British began to retreat at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, the church just moved in quite firmly to fill and become the new authority figure. And it did not tolerate anyone questioning its authority.
I find that fascinating, because looking at the Middle East, there's a parallel there for me. If you look at the mosque, if the state is ineffective, the mosque is the thing that fills the void. So that they're seeing the echoes of the Middle East there that were really interesting. So that explains in a way why really the church is almost like a state within a state. It's an alternative to the state. It has moral authority. Not only that, it's providing succor. It's actually providing health, food, and a social order where the British state is failing. So I think that's a really key point. Jumping forward, we talked about Paddy Doyle, but I'd like to talk about somebody who's been really key to addressing this issue and the attitudes towards her, both within the church and then how, basically how the church treated her, but then also how our society reacted to her over the past 2-3 decades. And I'm talking about Marie Collins.
Yes, Marie Collins is a key woman. For many years, she was known internationally. She was working in a commission in the Vatican and the Holy See to deal with questions of child abuse, because she herself is a survivor. And in Ireland, she's probably the best known of the survivors who are speaking out, demanding church reform, and the church atone for it.
Can we go right back to what happened to her story before she gets put on the committee with, way before us, going back to the...
So the reason why she is in the position she is in now, because in 1960, she was a child in a hospital with a broken leg, and the chaplain, it was a Catholic hospital, was a priest called Paul McGuinness. He took pictures of her naked, of her genitals, and of other girls in the hospital. And she was unable to cope with this. She just could not understand how a man of God could do this. She suppressed this for 20 years.
But the important point is here, there's several things that happen along the way. I'm sorry, I'm repeating the book back at you, is that the photographs, he sent the photographs to the UK to be processed, and the British authorities, the developers saw them, sent them to the Scotland Yard, or who were the British police at the time, and they sent them to the Guard, to the Gardaí. And what happened to them there?
Yeah, the chief of police visited the Archbishop of Dublin. He said, you might want to have a look at this. he looked at John Charles McQuaid, a very powerful man in the Irish church history. He summoned in the priest on another day. He explained that apparently he said, I was always intrigued by the female genitalia. I did not have any sisters. He did, but he claimed this, and it all just disappeared. So you had evidence being vanished, a priest being moved around, an archbishop claiming not to understand what was going on, and a priest who promised never to do it again. But what happened was he was a young priest at that time, and what happened then for years and for decades afterwards, he was moved from one parish to the next. It's a pattern many of your viewers will be familiar with. One parish to the next, and in the late 90s, he actually ended up in my parish, which is in the north side of Dublin. And one day he just disappeared. And it was only when he disappeared I realized just what a strange figure he was. He was always surrounded by children. In his house was children. In his car were children. His disappearance, he ended up in court, appeared on the front page of the newspaper. That was all we knew. The next thing we knew, he'd appeared on the front page of a tabloid newspaper. He was sentenced, he went to prison. And I sought out Mary Collins because I said, Mary, something connects us. I said, that priest who abused you was in our parish until he disappeared, but our parish never spoke about him again. He's just disappeared. And I said to her, I said, when do we get to us? You know, we've had the abusing priest, there were bishops who covered up, there was the state who was colluding. And I said, but we've never actually talked about us, the people, the ordinary people. And she said, Derek, I've been waiting 20 years for somebody to ask me that question. So she, as a survivor, was waiting for the ordinary. She, you know, we have perpetrators, but she was looking for when are we going to talk about the bystanders?
Yeah. So that was the key thing. So just repeating that point is the priests themselves, failure of the Catholic Church to investigate it, then the cover-up of the Catholic Church and the collusion with the state. And the question you're asking and what she's saying here is, what did we all do about it? The another point, a couple of points in the book, was when she goes to her initial thought, because she too holds the church in high esteem. And when she goes to see a therapist, because she has a breakdown, to talk about what's happened to her, she actually goes to a priest to talk about it. And what's his reaction to it?
Yes, his reaction is, don't tell me any more, because if you do, I'll have to do something about it. Don't give me any names. And the irony, of course, is after this, so this was a priest in her parish on the other side of Dublin. But when Paul McGuinness disappeared from our parish about 10 years later, he was replaced by this very priest. So a priest who told Mary Collins to go away and not bother him was actually put into our parish after the abusing priest disappeared to kind of put the rug over everything. And it's just, I mean, it's just staggering. And I think the key thing that Mary Collins encouraged me was, we talk about the church, we talk about priests, we talk about the state. I want to talk about Irish citizens. I want to talk about Irish passport holders. And I think we've flipped the narrative in Ireland. We used to be very proud of our religious, and many people have, there's many good reasons to be proud of them. They educated the world. But as soon as things went wrong, we flipped the narrative, and suddenly they were no longer ours, they were them. And people in Ireland still talk about the church, the priests. And I've just gently suggested to them, they are Irish people, and they are subject to the same privileges and responsibilities and laws as everybody else. So we've sort of psychologically othered them, because accepting that they're part of us, it's a bit like the kind of society accept a child abuser is a part of their community. Or
because it's important to point out with Marie Collins, she those complaints came out in the 90s, as you said, when what's his name? I've forgotten the name of the priest. McGuinness. It was disappeared. We're talking about 97, 98. So this is not that long ago. We're talking 20, 25 years ago. But she was ostracized at that time when she came out with these complaints, and when she actually, put forward her charges, she was dismissed and heavily criticized.
Yes, and the police almost didn't take on her case. It was only that somebody else came out parallel at the same time with similar claims from a completely different parish. They couldn't have known each other, so they corroborated each other. So Ireland closed rank for quite a long time, until it was impossible to ignore. And now people in Ireland, they praise these people for coming forward, but they never want to talk about why did they not want to hear what they have to say in the 80s with Paddy Doyle, in the 90s with Mary Collins. And that is a very painful thing when societies just decide no, they just close the door. Eventually the door will open, and then you have to explain your hesitancy for addressing it in the past. And that's what the book is about.
Okay. You talk about I think people are going to be familiar with the Magdalene, the laundries, and obviously there was a famous film made based on one story there. And there was the Doyle had basically a hearing and a public apology. Can you just talk a bit about that and your reaction to that at the time?
Yes, the laundries, the Magdalene laundries were homes set up for so-called fallen women. It was sort of a Victorian idea. They had them in Britain, they had them in Australia, in other countries. What was unusual about Ireland is these laundries survived. The last closed down in 1996, I believe, which is absolutely shocking. The laundries were places where society got rid of women who did not meet the ideal of Irish maidenhood, if I may put it sarcastically. People who were having women, children out of wedlock, women who were considered problematic, maybe who needed help, psychological help, women who were considered too sexy. They were locked up. There was no trial, there was no bail, there was no hearing, there was no nothing. They were washing laundry to wash away symbolically their sins. Named after Mary Magdalene, a woman who was also claimed besmirched her reputation as a prostitute. And this survived because Ireland needed it. Ireland needed a place to get rid of people who did not meet its. The church had built itself up to such a holy level, a holy Irish Catholic or holy Catholic Ireland, and these women did not meet this norm, so they had to disappear. But it took decades of dogged research by other people to just say, this happened. These are your sisters.
But you had an issue with this. So there was a hearing. I mean, it was many of the victims were invited to the Doyle. There was an apology by the state where they said, it's not your shame, it is our shame. It's Ireland's shame. And what was because your reaction to that I thought was interesting.
Yes, because they had a big day and they were invited to meet the president in his official residence. And it was a big day, and many women who felt that they'd been ostracized in the past and they'd always felt slightly soiled or dirty were suddenly told, no, it's not you. You did not do this. You didn't do anything wrong. Irish society did. So many of them felt this was a great day, but many people were sitting around looking strange. And I spoke to some of them and they said, who is this for? And many women said they had the impression this was Ireland trying to apologize to itself. Or it was trying to sort of offer an apology and accept it on behalf of these women. And many of these women did not feel Ireland had ever fully owned up to what it had done. And Irish people were still in slight denial. So it was a day of sort of an Oprah Winfrey style. Everyone was crying and hugging and the media loved it and it looked great. But many women were not playing along with the narrative that Ireland wanted them to play along with. So I had a very ambivalent experience that day. And many women still say, officially Ireland is apologizing, but officially, privately, they're still battling for pensions, for healthcare, for memorials. So official Ireland speaks in two sides of its mouth on these issues.
We're going to talk about a key person in all of this, and that's Cardinal Sean Brady. And I want to talk about him for some time. Sean, can we just say how important a figure he is within the Catholic Church? He was a cardinal, so incredibly senior within the Catholic Church. Just give me an idea of who he was.
Sean Brady, until recently, was the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland. His seat was in Armagh, the traditional seat of St. Patrick, and he came from a humble farming background. And he spent time in Ireland, also spent time in the Irish College in Rome. And he was a very hugely surprising figure to be picked for the head of the church, quite a modest figure. My family and his family would have known each other over the decades. And he's from Cavan, so near the Northern Ireland border. And he was just considered exactly the right kind of priest, the kind of priest Ireland does well, very modest, very soft-spoken, but very humble, but a man of God. So when he became the cardinal, and this is huge news, huge pride in the parish where my mother grew up. And then it emerged that his entire career was built on not a lie, but on a very, very bad choice. And that choice was, in 1975, he was asked by his bishop, he was a simple priest at the time.
Are you going to pull you up there? So you're saying his entire career was built on that? That's a pretty, we're about to talk about.
He made a choice. He was asked to do something early on in his career, which 30 years later came back to haunt him. And actually, as soon as he returned to Ireland to become cardinal, he was in Rome at the time, the clock had actually started ticking on, it was a slow acting time bomb, and it eventually detonated and ruined his reputation for many people in Ireland. And what ruined it was what happened in 1975. He was a young priest. He was asked to interview boys who claimed a priest had abused them. He interviewed them. He wrote a report and he said, I believe the boys. The report just disappeared. The priest, who was part of a religious order, was never sanctioned. He went on to abuse children for 2 decades. He was eventually put on trial. He died shortly after his conviction. And it was only in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Sean Brady was now rising through, he was now the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland, suddenly it emerged that he knew about this in the mid 70s, but he claims he had no power to do anything. He had no obligation to report it to the authorities. And he claims he's being scapegoated as the ultimate.
What's very interesting about this is that you spoke to the man, or the boy, as it was, or one of the boys who was abused by this priest, Brendan Smythe, or did you say Smythe or Smith? I think it's Smythe, isn't it? Smith. And that he'd gone through this abuse. His father brought it to the church. And then his son, the person who'd been abused, was brought before this commission of priests, where he was put before a terrible sort of inquisition. And that was held in secret, and that was what was sort of covered up.
Exactly. And Sean Brady became almost like a lightning rod. There have been many cases like this at the time, but this was almost like the perfect storm. So you had a young priest swearing himself to secrecy, not reporting, not acting on behalf of the children, and apparently just being more concerned with the reputation of the church and sort of developing his reputation as a safe pair of hands. And when all this came out, people said, I wonder, was he more interested in his career than the welfare of children? And he had been hounded quite a lot in the media, perhaps some people would say quite rightly, when it eventually all came out. They said, how could you do this? How could you not report it? And in my book, I interviewed him several times.
So why did you choose to, I mean, there had, as you said, I mean, he'd been interviewed countless times. Why did you choose to spend so much time with him? Because you do spend, you see him over several months.
It was almost a moral thing. Because my family knew his family, I didn't quite know, do I have an in with him? Or am I prejudiced to believe that he's a good person? Many people do believe he's a good person still. He was put in an impossible situation. So I wanted to understand. I don't believe he was an evil man. I just wanted to understand the mentality that would.
And just to repeat, this is the most important man in the Catholic Church, directly linked to.
He's in one person. He sums up everything that was good and bad about the church. And I think at the end of we had 5 interviews, and he agreed to talk to me because he said, well, what have I got to lose? And he knew my family, so he thought, well, maybe I'll get a different kind of hearing. And I tried not to be aggressive. I tried to let him tell the story. And I tried to use what Carl Rogers, a therapist from the 20th century, would call ultimate positive regard. I wanted to understand why he felt he could and couldn't act as he did.
So breaking that down, what were his initial defenses? I mean, I think his background was as a canonical, a lawyer, a church lawyer, an expert in canon.
Yes, I mean, he was a young man in his 30s at that stage, and he felt he knew exactly how serious this was. He wrote a report, he filed it with his bishop. He didn't ask any questions. That's the way the Catholic Church worked and works. It's a medieval hierarchical system.
So how did he justify that? I mean, how did he explain that?
Well, at the end of the chapter, I basically say the provocation with him is not that he acted unusually, but he acted the way anyone in Ireland would act. Unfortunately, we would like to think as priests, as a bishop, he should be held to a higher standard. The church would view itself as a moral authority. He's a provocation to many people in Ireland because he acted the way most people would act. The priests. And
you said that was out of, one of the questions you asked is that about out of ambition? One of the other questions was, is it out of respect for church law? There were multiple questions you asked.
Yes, but also he was a product of Ireland. In Ireland, the police would hand pictures to a bishop and not ask any questions about pictures of children being abused. In Ireland, people didn't ask questions. So Sean Brady was a perfect product, both of the church and of the state. It was a place where you did not ask questions, where if you close things down in your mind, I honestly believe he closed down in his mind what he knew, and he felt, well, I've done my bit, and he made clear he believed these children. So he said to himself, now the key moment for me was when he said, I don't know why I didn't allow these children's suffering to touch me. He said, if I'd done that, I probably would have acted differently. I said, if this had been your nephew, what would you have done? Would you have been slightly more energetic? Would you have gone to the police? Or probably, he said, but the system he was in, both the church system and the state system, in Ireland, it had sort of a deadening effect on his brain, and he knew instinctively what he should and should not do, and what he should not do was make a fuss.
Why do you think? I mean, I understand he's the head. He was the head of the Catholic Church, but in terms of what he actually did, and compared to the roles of so many other people within the church and within the authorities, why is there so much anger focused on him?
Yeah, I think that's also unfortunate because he rose so high, and it has so many of the elements of other cases all in one person. He rose so high, and I think unfortunately many people are retroactively saying he should have done more. He's the head of the church, but of course at the time he was just a simple curate. Now he did have a canon law degree, but he didn't actually do anything illegal. He did something highly immoral, I would say. He did not protect a child. But in the laws of the state at the time, he did not act illegally. Actually, ironically, the laws of the church at the time, he could have done more, but he chose not to, just as the bishop chose not to, and the head of the order chose not to. There was an inquiry into this. But actually, the legal inquiry of Northern Ireland, which was in the early 2000s, they actually did not say he did anything wrong. They named many people who did many things wrong, and this abuser was allowed abuse for 30 years, Brendan Smith. But they actually did not make any findings against him, which I think is important as well. So the court of public opinion has been quite clear. This man, Sean Brady, is immoral, and he's just a ruin. He is a non-person. I make the case in the book that he's a provocation for people because he reminds them of themselves.
I thought that was the interesting parallel. If you think of Germany, for example, I think there's the belated rush to prosecute accountants, and somebody might have been a guard at a prison camp, which clearly have some moral culpability. But I guess, in my view, in some ways, it doesn't make up for all the people they let off the hook.
Germany in the decades after the war chose not to prosecute people. They chose that it couldn't. Because the instinct was to protect itself. So they're kind of making belatedly up for lost time. I mean, I do make certain comparisons in the book, not between Nazi Germany and Catholic Ireland, but just the appetite of countries to address their past as a collective, or do they just take the short circuit approach and find a few scapegoats and blame them? So I would say that Germany has a model effect for other countries, but it's up to each country to adapt that model for themselves.
Yeah. I'd love to get some questions in a second. So let's bring in. We've got Simon Jackson there. So let's bring in some questions now. I got tons more questions, but I'll hold back. Simon, you go ahead. Go
on. To what extent and how does the latest generation of clergy dissociate itself from those who are now senior in the church, who presumably, many of whom were at best in denial?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Simon. I would speak of three generations. I think the generation that's kind of retiring, if not died, let's say 75 plus, those are the generation of looking away or covering up. So, and then you have a generation below them, I would say, let's say the 50 to 70 generation. And then you've got the young priests, the priests you're referring to. So you've got sort of a bit of a gap between them. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church remains the hierarchical organization it is. And so I would say two things. These people are Irish citizens and they're young priests. So the young priests I interviewed, they seem to be very much pulling in their head. They feel the church is under attack. We cannot have a discussion about this, really. We will always be attacked. We cannot say anything right, so we will just say nothing. So the church has been silenced, which is a staggering state of affairs, that the church has been cowed into silence. But also as young people, they're not that different to other young people in Ireland. I met many younger people, let's say under 30 in Ireland, who whether or not they have a connection with the church, this just seems like another country to them. They cannot fathom that this was their country. This is their country. This was their parents, their uncles. So I almost see a slightly dangerous thing that people say, I can't deal with it. That's nothing to do with me. Some people say, I don't go to church. I don't need to deal with this. And that's actually where I sound the alarm bell in my book. So whether you're a priest or a non-priest, if you've got a 25-year-old in Ireland who thinks, that this Ireland is not their Ireland, it is. There are lots of dynamics. There's unanswered questions about how we approach authority, and so on, that have never been addressed. So 25-year-olds need to read this book to understand whether it's a priest or not. This did happen in Ireland. This can happen in Ireland, and will continue to happen in Ireland.
We've got some good questions coming through, but I want to reiterate what you're saying in the book, which is that the priests are a product of Irish society, and also you make the strong overlap between the Irish church and the Irish state. And I think it's actually interesting you don't actually analyze in the book the changes that have taken place in modern Ireland today. And in a way, I don't think you give enough credit to what has taken place. And maybe it's stating the obvious to an Irish audience, but if you're not from Ireland, I think it's almost worth stating that these enormous changes have taken place. You talk about that sort of Venn diagram where you have overlapping society, church, and state together. And I would argue now, the church is over there, whereas beforehand it was sort of completely integrated.
Well, so what I said in the book with the Venn diagrams, I was trying to understand in my head, like, here's the church and here's the state, and how much overlap was there. And there was actually no consensus in Ireland about how much the church was basically swallowed the state, or maybe there was overlap, or was the church state a subset of the church, or vice versa. And we have because you're right, Ireland has made huge leaps and bounds. They know what they don't want. They don't want the church telling them what they do, but nobody can answer to me the question, well, why did you agree to allow the church to dictate your life for so long? And what was the cost to you and to other people? That's the part that Ireland isn't prepared.
I like, you have a very good example of how a parish church is built and the collusion between the state and then the debt that's dumped on the parishioners once the church is being built. On land, basically land handed back to the church, sold, bought very cheaply from the state, and then the parishioners get dumped with the debt. I thought this was like the conspiracy.
I use another example when they excavated Viking ruins of Dublin, and this was back 30 years ago, and they discovered that their way of redeveloping the city was they would just burn down the old buildings and build on the foundations of the old buildings, new wooden buildings. And I just make the point psychologically, if you just burn down the building or knock it down and build on the old foundations, you're limited by the foundations that were there before. And I'm suggesting that Ireland is quite quick to topple the tower of the church and knock down the walls of the church symbolically, but they're still building society on rules. And I would say, for instance, Ireland's response to the pandemic, other countries were using rule books like in Germany, it was rule for this and a rule for that. Ireland was using shame as a control mechanism to control the population a year ago and 18 months ago. And I said, I know no other country in the world that is using shame to contain people. We're falling back on what we instinctively know from Catholic Ireland, and we're unconsciously doing it. And I would suggest it's rather unhealthy if you're calling on shame to control people. Shame on you, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be.
Because these issues are not, still too raw, still too recent. They're still too recent. There are two very familiar people. It's not just Graham Fry, but there's somebody else there with him. Hello, Graham and Philip.
Oh, hi.
Hello there.
Hi. Derek, quick one. There's an old saying that you can take the person out of the church, but you can't take the church out of the person. Do you think this applies to countries as well? And when the dust settles, that the influence of the church could reassert itself in some quite strong way in Ireland?
I think the church is still asserting itself. The Catholic Church as an institution and as Catholicism as teaching have always asserted themselves, and Irish people and always will. And I think that's why I sort of slightly disagree with Nicholas. Ireland has made leaps and bounds and so on. If you look on the surface, but when you dig underneath, I think, what I just said there about shame as a way of controlling people, we still have unanswered questions. It's maybe more post-colonial, but we're still a very hierarchical country. If an expert says something, everyone just kowtows to what they say. We have somebody told me we have a deference addiction. So, the bishop is gone, but a hospital consultant or a senior doctor will have the same kind of intimidating effect on many people in Ireland the way a bishop.
I think the European Union, to some extent, has replaced the Catholic
Union.
Church.
I would agree. If Brussels says something, I would also say tech companies in Ireland, Facebook and Google. The government and the state and many Irish people will do anything or to not cross them and not question authority. And so I think something like the deference addiction, which somebody named, it's not my phrase, that's a holdover. So I don't know if the Catholic Church will come back as an institution.
That was Marie Collins's her term, wasn't it? Abuse.
Personally, I should probably, for the record, say I am a practicing Catholic. I think if I'd stayed in Ireland, I wouldn't be, because of just the mediocrity and the horror. But living in Germany, I suppose it's called the Luther effect. There's sort of a different type of Catholicism on offer, so it encourages you more to self-responsibility and so on. But the Catholicism in Ireland, I think, needs to die. That type of Catholicism was a product of the 19th century. it had its time. It had huge, tremendous achievements, but it also was very narrow, very condemnatory. It was obsessed with sex. That needed to go. So maybe it needs to collapse for something new to come out. But the Irish, because they have this arrogance that they somehow almost invented Catholicism, because they had it since the 5th century, they almost think that because it's collapsed in Ireland, Catholicism as a faith system is useless. But what they don't realize is their particular version of it has proved surplus to requirements. So until people realize that, maybe there's no chance for any type of Christian faith in Ireland.
Coming back to you, Graham, were you thinking of anywhere else in particular, or did you have a sort of a reading of Ireland? I mean,
well, I was thinking particularly about the influence of the evangelicals in the US, for instance, who America's clearly based as a the separation of church and state, but religion has a huge influence on the right-wing politics in the US. So, and there are other places as well. If you look at certain countries in South America, or the church has a big influence, and even though ostensibly it's not part of the political process.
Yeah, no, we do see there is like a lot of Western European countries, there's a new charismatic sort of super church movement coming on. They even have it here in Germany. I'd say, I mean, with the pandemic has scrambled everything. People will always need religious belief. It's been around since time began. So I don't think the Catholic Church has much to offer in terms of moral integrity as an institution. Christianity, perhaps in an evangelical form, perhaps. But yeah, after this pandemic is over, people will want to find some way of mourning, and it will be interesting to see, do they go back to churches? Ireland does funerals very well. I think it's one of the things we do extremely well, and many funerals couldn't happen. So that was still, you could still see that was a deep cut for people. That's a deep wound, and it'll be interesting if the Catholic Church can help heal those wounds, or whether people will go elsewhere. But Irish people are religious people. They are people of faith. It's just the institution that claim to represent their spiritual needs failed them and needs to die before something new can come.
Okay. I'd love to get more questions, please. If you everyone put more questions in the Q&A box, it'll be a help to me as well. I do want to come back to this question of how Ireland has changed. We clearly get the main thrust of the book. That we did a political tour of Northern Ireland mainly, but we also spent time in Dublin, and we were looking at Brexit and basically the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland. And then when we came to Dublin, I was tremendously impressed by the politicians, decision makers, civil servants in Dublin, and I think they had a much greater grip, a much better grip of British constitutional issues, as well as the sort of how Ireland and the UK fit within Europe, than British politicians did within Westminster. And so for me, that was sort of symptomatic or proof perhaps of a state that has moved way beyond the sort of cliched small island dominated by Catholicism, moved well beyond the sort of the ideas of Ireland that we have, a confident nation, an idea with a different and a new identity. I mean, you have to, I'd like you to maybe sort of illustrate some of that, because we're trying to assess how far Ireland has and hasn't changed.
Yes, well, the first thing that jumped into my mind is probably about 90% of those politicians who you met, if not all of them, were educated in Catholic schools. So the Catholic Church still controls most of the schools. It was a sort of an unusual thing that they did a deal with the state in the early decades. So 100 years ago, the Irish state won its independence in several stages, but it was broke. It had no money. So the church moved in and said, it was like a public-private partnership. We'll do schools and we'll do hospitals and social welfare and welfare. And that still persists to this day. Most of the hospitals in the state, most of the schools in the state are run by the Catholic Church. There may not be priests and nuns walking the corridors and in the classrooms, but they operate to a Catholic ethos. So many people now don't even understand that that's unusual, that usually you have state schools. So many of the people might not be churchgoers, but they will have gone to Catholic schools and they will have absorbed a bit of what Graham was saying. They will have absorbed a lot. And that may have actually pushed them against the church, but the Catholic tentacles are still there, and it's almost impossible to separate these out now, to separate the church and state. And So that would be the first thing. Most of the Catholic schools did a very good job. I mean, so if you're meeting young, confident, educated people, it's because these schools did a good job. They were Catholic schools. They weren't state schools. They were state-run, but Catholic-led, as it were. And how Ireland has changed today, yes, it is. I mean, like a lot of young states, it's not quite as like Poland or East Germany. You know, they sort of were let out of the traps after decades of communist rule, and they sort of immediately threw out all their furniture and got a new car. And so we haven't had that. It was more like a transition. But there has been a huge energy released that was being spent in churches on a Sunday or at meetings, or just playing along to a certain role that everyone thought everyone else expected of them, to be the good Irish Catholic. So once you get rid of all that expectation, you've released tremendous energy. So you had, the economic transformation, and so, you know, people were suddenly buying stuff. Ireland became a very materialist country. Ireland previously was a poor country, so we worked the narrative and said, we're poor because we're holy because we're poor. Suddenly there was money in the country in the late 90s. You know, they weren't holy anymore. They just wanted stuff. So Ireland has gone through a process similar to Poland or East Germany, just slightly less dramatic.
Yeah. Well, just reminded, GDP per capita in Ireland compared to the UK?
I've been out of Ireland for 20 years. I have no idea.
It's bigger. It's
well,
bigger.
GDP is distorted in Ireland because we have a lot of countries making
Googles and
pharmaceuticals, pills, Viagra, all of that stuff is fed into our GDP. So if you stripped out what multinationals are making and actually use the rest as a basis for GDP, I think the UK would probably do better.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Diane Cook, go ahead, Diane. I think you're there. Go on.
No, you were just promoting me to, not quite to glory, I hope, but it stopped my voice. Derek, to what extent is the society's view of women, do you think, if it did, contributed to the phenomenon of the Magdalen laundries? And I was quite taken aback when you said it extended into the 1990s.
Derek, can you say that? I mean, probably don't have to quote it word for word, but the appalling comment that you were given by a very senior member of the Catholic Church when you were doing this book, which, you know, I would say reflects some of those attitudes right up into today.
Oh, yeah. So that was to do with the abuse?
Yes, to do with the abuse. Yeah. Basically, well, if she'd been abused, she deserved it because she was very attractive and, you know, pornographically attractive.
Well, am I supposed to say the sentence?
I don't know. You're cool.
Well, a priest who was a canon lawyer, senior canon lawyer, was being asked about Mary Collins, the woman who'd been abused, had pictures taken of her while she was naked as a child. And he just casually said to me, oh, well, she must have had a very photogenic fanny. And that for me was the moment where I realized these priests have such a warped view of womanhood, of women, generally sexuality in the broader sense. And these were moral authorities in Ireland. So, and that
comment was made in 2019? When was that?
Like this was today. This is not something he said in the past. And he felt casually able to say it. But Irish, so I mean, Diane's attitude was society's view of women. Society was men and women. So what did men and women in Ireland think of women? And many women in Ireland and many men in Ireland subscribed to a traditional view, which was no contraception, and women are not allowed work after they marry. Women are subjugate. Women exist only in the orbit of their husband. Women who divorce cease to exist. Divorce was illegal in Ireland until 1996. So women, I mean, we like to forget it. There was a vote for abortion to allow abortion about 5 years ago now. 3 years ago. But in 1983, the Irish people voted in a constitutional referendum to insert a reference to our constitution saying that life begins with conception, making abortion completely illegal. So Irish people created a ban on abortion for themselves, and then they removed it with great fanfare. But in that debate to remove it, the vote was eventually successful to remove this amendment from the Irish Constitution. There was very little debate, but why did we put it in there in the first place? So I think myself and Nicholas are slightly on different sides of the argument here. Nicholas, you're right. We voted for to allow abortion. Irish people voted for marriage equality. We've had turns, but we never asked, why did we beat up gay people? Why did we murder gay people? Why did we refuse to allow women to have abortions and tolerate them taking the boat to England for decades? Why did we do that? And I don't see those debates. So I'm gently trying to suggest that maybe we need to have those debates in our understandable wish and urge to rush on and catch up as we would see it. If you rush too much, you kind of forget what you were capable of and the dynamics that made that possible. And the dynamics for women were staggering. I think the work is really only beginning on that. So not only what women were subject to, but also the class issue in Irish Catholicism was very class aware, very snobbish, and the whole class question in the
you do talk about that in the book, and that does come through. I mean, you tell us about where you grew up and who you were, and did that give you some kind of protection from, I mean, you talk about how it was clear that the church realized those who were poor and those who were middle class, and if you were poor, you were far more likely to end up being abused.
Yes, I mean, it's not a science, but if I did a map of Dublin, let's say I grew up in Dublin, and put dots where the abusing priests were and where they were relocated to, you won't find any of them any middle-class parishes, because middle-class parishes are filled with fathers who are lawyers, and I think they knew, let's not move him there because we'll have a lawsuit on our hands. So I grew up in a parish that was sort of created in the 60s, modern housing estates. We were sort of on the edge of a council, social housing estate, and we lived in private houses. So there was a class thing there. People were living in sort of Dublin Corporation public housing, renting their homes. We were in private, so we were slightly upper on the one step up on the social scale, but we were all very much under the thumb of the Catholic Church, and it seemed a colossus. The church ran the schools, the church ran everything. I looked at a newsletter recently. It was like the Catholic Horticultural Society. I mean, what does Catholicism have to do with horticulture? But it organized everything. You could not escape. So there was no escape. If you wanted a social life, you had to be in the church. And so I'm not trying to blame people for not being braver. It would be like social debt to stand up to a priest. But many of the people from that parish were carrying scars of little rebellions against the priest from 50 years ago. They could still remember the wounding lash of the tongue of the priest. So it's staggering to believe the church is still there. I kind of wanted to just record it and go there before it disappears, and it's going to disappear in the next 10 or 20 years. Just remind people in the future what it was like in its last years.
Yeah, there were 2 points in your interview with Brady that really came across, was that if the issue if the issue of abuse was raised now and you wanted to report it to the police, he said you'd still have to check with somebody in the church before you reported it. And that seemed quite staggering, although I think the laws, clearly that's not the case. I mean, you have every obligation.
The relationship between church and state will probably never be, it'll never be fully clarified. And that's what makes the coming to terms with the past so difficult here compared to, let's say, dealing with East Germany or Nazi Germany. The Irish state still exists. The Irish state has no interest in revealing too much about what it was doing in the past. It will fight every step of the way. And we still don't have any sort of inquiry into sort of how the state was operating. We have individual inquiries into individual types of institutions, laundries or children's homes, but never a big inquiry into sort of church-state relations. And the church is weakened, but the state still survives. East Germany vanished, so West Germany had no problems opening up the archives. I don't think West Germany would open up West Germany's archives. So the difficulty of coming to terms with the past in the Irish context is the Irish state has changed, but effectively, the same civil servants, the same files, the same procedures, and the same desire to cover up, which is an instinct that I think they also have from the Catholic Church.
Yeah, you sort of answered it in a way, but I'm interested to get your sort of further analysis on it. And this is a question from my mother, who watches regularly. She says, how do you think the situation will change? Are the public likely to come back to the church in numbers if it doesn't change materially? And you've basically said it's not happening.
There's still, I looked at the numbers, there's still 30%. Again, the pandemic has scrambled everything, but last time I checked, there was still about 30% of people going to church. In Dublin, the churches are empty, but if you go down to the
30% is huge. I think the number here is something like
5%. It's staggering. That was one of the reasons I wanted to do the book. I said, the story is not why did people leave? It's like, why are these people still there? And I speak to some of them in the book, and And some of them say, well, I'm not going to let these idiots, these priests and bishops, take away my faith. And Irish people do, many people, particular generation, have a huge, tremendous personal faith. They've just completely lost trust in the institution, which gives them almost like a Protestant faith where, you know, the institution is secondary. It's about your own personal relationship. So, I mean, the irony is that the Irish Catholic Church has probably created more quasi-Protestants than the British ever succeeded in doing. But then in the countryside, I mean, there's still quite a healthy relationship. You know, people aren't going to take any shit from the priests anymore, but they just realize it is part of the fabric. So I wouldn't rule it out yet, but the current mentalities, or the mentalities that allowed what happened to happen, will have to die out. Those people will have to die out. And I'd say it's too soon to say it's the end of Catholicism in Ireland, but definitely the institution as it was will have to change into something radically different, which is going to happen anyway, just because priests are disappearing, priests are dying. The average age of priests in Ireland is something like in the late 60s. So
yes, as you say, it's still so interwoven within the fabric of society, education, and even healthcare.
No, personally speaking, I mean, I go to church and I try to understand. I'm more of a doubter than a believer, but I do believe societies are the poorer. I mean, if you're all you have in life is to look forward to the next iPhone, you know, I say in the book, I said, like, take what you know, it's clear what people have rejected in Ireland, but what if you replaced it with how are you getting through life? What is your sense of meaning? What do you only ever really think of the big questions when you're burying somebody you know in a funeral? And I don't really know. Ireland is like a lot of countries sort of in a post-religious state. We're in a secular stage, and I'm saying, well, what happens after secularism? Is secularism the end of the road? You know, is sort of a secular materialist liberal democracy? Is that the end? You know, it's a bit like saying the end of history. Francis Fukuyama. You know, we all know history kept developing, and I think, you know, there's a debate in Germany about post-secularism. What does that mean? So, getting back to what Graham was saying, maybe it would be evangelical churches and so on. So the road hasn't ended for religious belief in Ireland. Just this institution has run out of the road.
How's the book? How has it gone down at home? What's been reception?
Very well. I was saying to you before, I mean, this book came out in the middle of a pandemic, and I joked with my publisher and I said, if people buy this book in the middle of a pandemic, we'll know the pandemic is serious, because they're of their own free will reading a book about Catholicism. It's a tremendously burdensome topic. And many people have been surprised. Many people want to stay away with it. I mean, if this picture actually on the cover is very triggering for a lot of people. It's during the Pope's visit in 1979.
Is that actually a photograph? Because it looks like it's been composed with different photographs.
No, it's actually a photograph. It was colorized, which makes it look slightly not quite of this world. But I think that's what makes it so wonderful. And everyone in Ireland can associate, everyone over 30 can associate with somebody in this picture. And it's done tremendously well.
Yeah, I think, Isabel, if you're there, can we just produce a picture of the book? It'll take Isabel just a few seconds to bring it up.
Sure.
Yeah, there we go. There we go.
Yeah, so everyone in Ireland can recognize themselves in that. I can't get enough of that picture. And it just reminds people of in Ireland that we were all there. And that's sort of the basis of the starting point for my book. Let's not pretend we weren't there. That's not just... A lot of people in Ireland would like to think we just like to drink lattes and we like to eat sourdough bread and we have a cafe culture, even though we don't because of the rain. And I'm just saying, yes, that's true. We have all that now, but this is how we used to be. Why were we like that? And what happened? And right in the middle, you can see this woman with the gray hair. She's got her eye on everything. She's watching. That woman is the woman who made Catholic Ireland, held it together. You know, the priests would be afraid of her. She would see people in the parish. She'd have a word in the priest's ear. The daughter would disappear to a Magdalene laundry, you know, that, and then just below her there's a little boy peering out. I only saw him recently. I've been looking at this cover for a year, and this is a little boy just to the right of the girl who's yawning. There's a little boy peering out there, and I saw him 2 weeks ago for the first time. I could swear he wasn't there before, and yet that's me. And when I look at that book cover now, I see him. I saw stuff, only one eye is visible. I saw enough. I couldn't do much. It was a teenage boy, but I saw a priest in a car, surrounded by children, in a house surrounded by children, and I just knew it was weird, and I just didn't know what to do. And I can say I have the blessing of a late birth. If I was 10 or 20 years older, I'd have really some serious questions to ask myself.
Yeah, and that the point is that you see that the fundamental question is that if you're Irish, you were there. What was your part in it? At least to ask that question.
Well, I call it the continuum of knowing. I mean, we talk about perpetrators, we talk about victims, but I say, like, victim here, perpetrator here. And everyone in society is somewhere between that. And this is a model that applies for any society. I mean, if Britain is looking at its colonial past, what did your family benefit from going back a few decades? And if you're somewhere between a perpetrator and a victim, where are you and why? And what did you see and not see? How did you feel you could react? Did you feel you had any agency?
I also that this is such a recent past. It's within living memory, and that's why it's so uncomfortable as well. I mean, it's easier if you're you took the Holocaust as one thing, but it's easy if you don't have living memory of it to say, okay, this is I need to understand it, but I wasn't involved. But here you are, you're talking about something where people actually were alive and arguably they were involved.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is in some ways the book has come too soon, because they say 30 years and files start to become available during the 30-year rule and so on. But I just wanted to put down a marker now and talk to people like Sean Brady who were around. I mean, Paddy Doyle, who I spoke to, has died since I wrote the book. So I just get that I had the last of the Catholic childhoods. I wanted to talk to the last of the eyewitnesses before they go. And I'd like to think that the book is there then for people in the future who want to look into it with more. I'm not a historian. This isn't a historical book. It's sort of a mixture. My friends say, I haven't been back to Ireland much. They say sometimes it's in the Ireland section, sometimes it's in the religion section, sometimes it's in the psychology section. Sometimes, happily, it's in the bestseller section. It was best-selling book in Ireland for a while. So it's going all over the place, and people seem to like it, which, considering the subject, it's not a given.
That's it. Where to place it? That's a good note to end on. Derek Skelly, thank you so much. We haven't spoken about Germany at all, but we will have you back on very soon to talk about that. But Derek Skelly, the best Catholics in the world, well worth reading. Thank you very much indeed. It's been really good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night, wherever you are.